A hush fell over the room. You guys are pretty quiet. Well, we're delighted to see you all this morning. Wish you a good morning. People coming from far and wide. And Senator Capito and I are delighted to be with you and delighted that you all could join us for this hearing. Today, we're going to hear from state and local officials on the reauthorization of the U.S. Economic Development Agency, or EDA, as we call it. And to our witnesses, Ms. Cannon, very nice to see you. Welcome, Patty. Mr. Fetzer, very great to see you. We have a son named Christopher. It's one of our favorite names. So. Commissioner Higgins, nice to see you. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. Mr. Graney from Mount Hope, great to see you. There's hope in Mount Hope. And you're bringing us some hope here today. And Mr. Day, nice to see you all. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your perspectives with us on EDA's important programs. And we look forward to hearing what the EDA is doing well and what improvements might help the agency work even better. As my colleagues heard me say more times than they want to remember, everything I do, I know I can do better. And I think the same is true of all of us, and the same is true of programs like EDA. And today, we're going to try to figure out how to keep a good thing going, but actually make it better and more effective. Before we hear from each of our witnesses, I want to share a couple of thoughts about EDA and why I think it's important for Congress to reauthorize this vital agency. Under the umbrella of the Department of Commerce, EDA leads the federal government's economic development agenda, as you know. EDA helps to bring job growth and economic opportunity to distressed communities in every region of our country. Additionally, EDA promotes innovation and competitiveness in local and regional economies across America to help them succeed in the global marketplace. As members of this committee, we have heard me say more than a few times, I represent a state that, much like a prize fighter, punches above its weight in terms of its contributions to the U.S. economy. The same can be said about EDA. This agency, small agency, packs a big punch and makes an outsized impact across our country, in almost every corner of our country. Despite all the exceptional work that EDA has done in every one of our states, the agency has not been reauthorized by Congress since 2004. That's about 20 years, and 2 decades. That's too long for an agency with such an important mission to go without renewed authorization. And let's think about the many ways that our workforce and our economy have changed since 2004. Just to mention a few, we have witnessed technological advances that has transformed the way that we live, the way that we work, and even the way that we travel. We have also seen significant changes in manufacturing and in energy production and in products we use on a daily basis. For example, the iPhone was first released in 2007, 3 years after EDA was last reauthorized. Broadband internet, which only limited households and businesses had access to in 2004, has become a necessity in our daily lives and our work. In addition, businesses are experiencing new challenges as well as new opportunities, such as how to operate more sustainably on a warmer planet. And through reauthorization, we have an opportunity to modernize and improve EDA's ability to foster additional economic growth. So why is this so important? Well, let me paraphrase President Abraham Lincoln when I say that the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. Lincoln was once asked, what is the role of government? He said, to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. EDA helps fulfill that role. Some communities across Lincoln was unable to join us as a witness today, but I thought I would give him a shout out. Some communities across our country are struggling with how to navigate today's economies. Over the past 2 decades, a number of factory towns have seen their last plant close and are seeking to attract new industries. In addition, cities are looking to reinvent themselves to compete on a global scale. EDA can play a role in helping communities turn their economic adversity into opportunity. What did Albert Einstein used to say? In adversity lies opportunity. He was right, and he's still right today. As many of you have heard me say, when I had the privilege of serving as governor of Delaware, our state created more jobs than in any other 8-year period of time. I didn't create one of them, but we helped to create, as Patty will recall, we helped to create a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation in our state that was hugely helpful. and still is helpful. And by working together, we can do the same thing in states across the country. There are many aspects to creating such an environment. I actually worked for a short while, and right out of the Navy, I got an MBA at Delaware on the GI Bill, and went to work for about 6 months in what was then the Division of Economic Development. People say, what did you learn in 6 months, whether you're working at the Division of Economic Development? Among other things, I learned the importance of workforce preparation, how that's a shared responsibility. I learned about access to capital. I learned about research, access to research funding, research that could be furthered and enhanced. I learned about protection of intellectual property. And those are just a few things that I learned. I only worked there for six. The other thing I learned, to paraphrase our president, he likes to say all politics is personal, all diplomacy is personal. One of the other things I learned is economic development is personal. Economic development is personal as well. And EDA plays an important role in supporting programs in almost everything I've just mentioned. I've also had an opportunity to witness firsthand the EDA's work in our home state, my home state of Delaware. I'm sure that many of our colleagues in the committee could cite chapter and verse on experiences of their own. For example, in the first state, we only have 3 counties in our southernmost county, Sussex County. EDA helped fund a Center for Automotive Excellence at the Delaware Technical Community College in Sussex County. Sussex County is one of the largest counties in America. They raise more chickens than any county in America, I believe. And they, at one time, raised more soybean than any county in America. But we needed to diversify the economy in there, and ADA has helped us to do that. But one of the ways was through a Center for Automotive Excellence at the Delaware Technical Community College, just outside of Georgetown, county seat. The center has helped us fill a need for trained automotive technicians to work not just at our auto dealerships up and down the state, but also to help maintain the heavy-duty trucks that are vital to our poultry industry. As I mentioned earlier, there are something like 300 chickens for every person that lives in Delaware. And we have these chicken processing places, poultry processing places, and then we send chickens out across the country in these huge trucks. And those trucks need to be maintained, and now they're getting help and the kind of maintenance that they need through this program. Delaware has also received funding from EDA to help our travel and tourism sector, and one of our state's largest economic drivers during the pandemic. As we'll hear from our witnesses today, EDA has an impact in communities large and small, in urban areas as well as rural ones. I look forward to working with our colleagues on this committee, with a ranking member especially, to ensure that EDA has the necessary tools to help those communities punch above their weight, just like it's helped to Delaware, my adopted state, West Virginia, my native state, and many other states as well. Before we hear from our witnesses, I want to turn first to our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening statement, and to give her the opportunity to introduce one of our witnesses today, whom I think she knows pretty well. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everybody, and thank you for calling today's hearing to discuss reauthorizing the EDA. And welcome to all of our witnesses traveling far and wide. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you. I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Mr. Graney. Thank you for being here today. Governor Jim Justice assembled a tremendous team of economic development experts and leaders who worked tirelessly for the betterment of my home state of West Virginia. Mr. Graney plays a pivotal role on that team as the executive director of the Department of Economic Development. Mr. Graney brings years of professional experience to his current position. He has spent most of his career in executive or co-founder positions with companies related to the petroleum industry. He was also president of One Stop, a chain of convenience stores based in West Virginia. Mr. Graney is very active. I can attest to this because we live in the same community, in many community and nonprofit organizations. So thank you, Mike, for coming. Economic development is difficult work, but the reward for West Virginia is obvious. Mr. Graney and the rest of his team will work with all government levels to bring economic opportunity to our state, and they have achieved some recent success that I hope he will talk about. Better jobs will allow West Virginians to continue to call the Mountain State home, as well as provide new careers for those who want to return home or join us in West Virginia. So I thank him and his team for their dedication to this vital effort. As we hear from our witnesses today, EDA is an important partner across the nation for those that are working to advance economic opportunities for their citizens. As the lead agency for federal economic development agenda, the EDA provides funding for critical infrastructure projects and other activities that support job creation and retention in economically disadvantaged urban and rural areas. During my time in the Senate, one of the things that I sought to do is to strengthen EDA's presence and assistance in my home state of West Virginia. I've been successful, I think. Since 2018, EDA has invested close to $233 million in 174 projects in West Virginia to help communities across our state grow economies and support and keep those jobs too, and support thousands of jobs. So the EDA's core programs do work. They have successfully supported locally driven economic development since their inception, and I know our witnesses will share more success stories with us today. However, it has been 20 years, as the chairman noted, since Congress last reauthorized EDA. Thankfully, we're kicking off this process to develop legislation to reauthorize the EDA. Time and time again, this committee has proven that we can work together in a bipartisan manner to pass meaningful legislation that tackles the nation's challenges and needs. I believe any reauthorization effort should focus on these things: reauthorizing EDA programs at fiscally responsible funding levels and reasserting a congressional direction over EDA funding decisions. 2, enhancing congressional oversight of EDA activities and encouraging coordination between other federal development programs and the private sector. 3, updating EDA's processes for program implementation and project delivery. And 4, preserving locally driven economic development decisions. We must achieve an appropriate balance with this legislation. That balance must uphold the core functions and goals of the EDA while thoughtfully modernizing the EDA and its authorities and programs. Further, I do not believe that we should be creating new programs. In recent years, EDA received a total of $4.5 billion in funding from the American Rescue Plan Act and the CARES Act. This was on top of the $1.2 billion total in supplemental appropriations provided to EDA for disaster recovery in 2018 and 2019. The Recompete pilot program, which was one of 2 new EDA programs authorized in the CHIPS and Science Act, received a total of $200 million in regular and supplemental appropriations in fiscal year 2023 consolidated appropriations. The Recompete pilot program will use eligibility metrics that vary from existing EDA grant programs and focus on areas where prime age employment trails the national average. The other EDA program established by the CHIPS and Science Act was the Tech Hubs program. This program is designed to accelerate regional technical growth and innovation through regional-based investments with the goal of becoming globally competitive in certain technologies and industries. This program received a total of $500 million in regular and supplemental appropriations in fiscal year 2023 Consolidated Appropriations Act. Given the significant funding levels provided by Congress to EDA, it is concerning that the majority of the agency's programs are administered under expired authorizations. It's past due that we put forth a serious bipartisan reauthorization proposal. The U.S. economy looks very different than it did 20 years ago, and EDA's authorizing statutes should reflect this reality. However, I must stress that the reauthorization legislation will not be successful if it departs from the EDA's traditional missions. The legislation should not be used to pick winners and losers. We must maintain EDA's focus on those areas that truly need assistance and continue with an industry-agnostic approach that emphasizes locally driven economic development decisions. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what policy and programmatic improvements can be made. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
If you'd like to go ahead and introduce Mike Graney now, you're welcome to do that. And,
I just did that.
yeah. Do you want to say anything else?
He's a great guy.
Okay. Okay. That's all you need to know. Yeah. I like to say the main thing is the main thing to keep the main thing, so that's a good thing to know. Welcome. I have the opportunity to introduce 3 of our witnesses and then turn to Senator Bozeman to introduce his witness. And thank him for being a big part of this committee and the work that we do. I'm delighted to welcome this morning Patty Cannon, who is Director of Special Projects for the Delaware Division of Small Business. Patty has worked for many years on economic development in Delaware. People say how long, I say not long enough. But in her current role, Patty works closely with the Economic Development Administration, as well as with business and community leaders across the first state to help grow Delaware's economy. Welcome. Great to see you. And we're also joined today by Chris Fetzer, who's the Executive Director of the Northern Arizona Council of Governments. I think Senator Kelly was instrumental maybe in inviting you to join us. He is tied up right now, but I'm sure he'll be joining us at some point in time in this hearing. But I understand that Mr. Fetzer is also the current president of the Board of National Association of Development Organizations, which advocate on behalf of economic development organizations across the country. When my wife asks me who I was with today, I will tell her I was with the president. We'll just leave it at that, Chris. Third, I'm pleased to note that we've been joined by Commissioner Eileen Higgins from Miami-Dade County, Florida, and you're joining us on behalf of NACO, I believe, the National Association of Counties. Commissioner Higgins was first elected to the Miami-Dade Commission in 2018, is that right? 2018, following a career that spanned being a business owner, Foreign Service officer, and community advocate. Thank you for coming. And now let me turn to Senator Boozman and ask him, if he will, to introduce Mr. Day for us.
Well, thank you, Senator Carper, and we appreciate yours and Senator Capito's leadership and the great example that you set in working together and trying to find common ground for this really so very important committee. I have the opportunity to introduce Brian Day. Thank you, Brian, for joining us today, and he's going to discuss the important role the Economic Development Administration has played in the Little Rock Port Authority's operations and expansion. Brian has been involved with state and local government for over 35 years and been the executive director of the Little Rock Port Authority since 2014. Under his leadership, the port has attracted industry from around the world, with 50 businesses now calling the port home. Together, these businesses employ around 10,000 people and contribute about $500 million annually to the region. Brian and the Little Rock Port Authority have leveraged EDA dollars as well as anyone, and I look forward to hearing his expertise on why the EDA is important to so many communities like Little Rock, Arkansas. It's certainly been a pleasure working with Brian for many years, and we appreciate all of his efforts for the great state of Arkansas. Thank you, Brian, for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Boozman. Before Patty Cannon speaks, we have one House member in from Delaware in the U.S. House of Representatives, and her name is Lisa Blunt Rochester. She used to be an intern in my office when I was a congressman years ago, and later I was on several occasions a member of my cabinet when I was governor, and I put out a statement yesterday in supporting her candidacy. And one of the things I mentioned, I talked about an old proverb that goes something like this: if you want to feed a person for a day, you could do that. But if you want to help a person eat for life, teach them how to fish. So if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. But if you want to make sure they can feed themselves for a lifetime, is teach them how to fish. Part of what we do is we're involved in that, in workforce training, workforce development. So with that thought in mind, I think it's noble work. I think it's noble work, and it's really important work. Patty, with that, you are welcomed and may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee that we hope will join you, sir. Thank you for this opportunity to offer my testimony before you today. My name is Patty Cannon. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the state of Delaware under the Department of State within the Division of Small Business, where I also serve as the Grantee Administrator for Foreign Trade Zone number 99 and as a member of the Delaware Workforce Development Board. I have worked closely with the U.S. Economic Development Administration, EDA, for over 20 years. And I come to you before you today to voice strong support for the reauthorization of EDA. On their website, the quote says, "Public work program investments help to facilitate the transition of communities from being distressed to becoming competitive by developing key public infrastructure. And while we firmly agree with that statement, and we strongly encourage the reauthorization of EDA to continue this important work, we'd like to recommend some of the following changes to EDA's policy to allow for faster deployment of funds to the communities when they are in need. One, to eliminate or significantly reduce the required match. It is a burden for small or underserved communities that lack the resources to meet that financial match. Consider setting aside 10% of EDA's public works allocation to be deployed via formula funding versus competitive funding. Allocate capacity-building, non-competitive funding to communities and applicants that have failed to successfully compete for EDA funding. This would strengthen the grant writing and federal reporting competencies in small, underserved communities and increase their capacity to seek funding from all sources, all funding sources, private, philanthropic, as well as government funding sources. Consider integrating the state and local workforce boards into the EDA funding criteria as an approved alternative to the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, the CEDS, document currently on file with EDA. CEDS are required to be updated every 5 years, but the majority of membership in your local and state workforce boards by U.S. Department of Labor requirements are 50% of the majority business owners that are CEOs, COOs, other individuals with optimum policymaking or hiring authority, and they provide employment in your demand occupations. So they may have a better pulse on what's happening. I currently serve as the program administrator for 2 EDA grants within the state of Delaware. The first was a CARES Act-funded revolving loan fund, an RLF. This was a competitive application process, and we were ultimately awarded $1.5 million. The second was an American Rescue Plan, ARPA, non-competitive travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation funding, where Delaware was awarded $7,759,540. But there are compelling differences in these 2 applications and the time it took to get those funds deployed into the community. The competitive RLF application took almost a full year to get through the application approval process and then the implementation plan approval process. The RLF program was distributed to 31 small businesses, resulting in the retention of 349 jobs across the entire state of Delaware. To date, only 1 out of those 35 businesses is in default on their loan. The remaining 30 small businesses survived the pandemic as a result of this investment. Every job matters, not just to the employee and their families, but to the economic prosperity of communities. It is true in Delaware. It is true in every community. The ARPA non-competitive application took less than 6 months to work through the approval of the application and the approval of the implementation plan. The ARPA non-competitive travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation funding resulted in $760 being returned to Delaware's economy for every $1 invested, and saved an industry that was dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Visitor spending topped $5.9 billion, a 30% increase from 2020, and 2021 total visitor spending exceeded 2019, the previous high mark, by 11% to set a new Delaware record. Tourism as an industry is the 4th largest private employer. 9% of all private sector jobs in Delaware are tied to the tourism industry. In closing, please know that the EDA staff at the Philadelphia Regional Office continue to be responsive, very patient, and highly committed to helping everyone in their region to be successful. We are grateful for the EDA funding that has been awarded to the state of Delaware, including funding to our universities and colleges that support sophisticated research and development and technology transfer. We fully respect, that there will never be enough funding to support every important project, but we firmly believe that the work of the EDA is important to the U.S. economy, and we ask this committee to move forward with the reauthorization. Thank you.
You know, you're 7 seconds over your time. That's pretty darn good around here.
I'm so sorry, sir.
No apologies necessary. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for that testimony. And next, we're going to hear from Chris Fetzer. Mr. Fetzer, please proceed with your testimony. Thanks for joining us.
Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Chris Fetzer. I serve as the Executive Director of the Northern Arizona Council of Governments, based in Flagstaff, Arizona. NACOG serves a four-county region and is an EDA-designated economic development district. I also currently serve as the President of the National Association of Development Organizations, which advocates on behalf of the national network of more than 400 EDDs across the country. Today, I'll begin by speaking about the importance of EDA and how its investments have impacted Northern Arizona. One prominent example of an ongoing challenge in my region has been the decline of the coal-fired power industry. In late 2019, the operators of the Navajo Generating Station, a coal-fired power plant located near the city of Page on the Navajo Nation, abruptly ended operations years prior to the facility's anticipated closure. While operational, the plant had employed hundreds of workers and brought in millions in revenue. As you might imagine, the plant's sudden closure resulted in devastating losses of jobs, business income, and tax revenue that the region was not fully prepared to address. This closure disproportionately impacted rural, tribal, and economically distressed communities. Fortunately, EDA is making investments to help support Northern Arizona's economic transition. As a result, we will be better positioned in the future to respond to similar scenarios. We're now engaging in planning measures to prepare for the impending closure of 3 remaining coal plants that are still operational in the region. These planning efforts are being supported by EDA-funded grants. EDA's successes extend far beyond my region. Nationally, EDDs are often at the forefront of driving EDA's local impact, as they have ever since EDA's creation in 1965. EDDs are important because they help local stakeholders access and navigate EDA funding opportunities. Our staff serve as EDA funding experts who are trusted locally. We're especially essential in helping rural, small, or capacity-constrained communities access funding. In other words, EDDs help those communities most in need secure federal grants. In reauthorizing the EDA, I encourage this committee to take the following actions. First, I encourage Congress to invest in the operational capacity of EDDs. Currently, the lack of adequate funding for staff capacity is an enormous challenge for most EDDs, in part because until recently, EDA funding levels for EDDs had stagnated for decades. Second, Congress should increase the annual authorized funding level for EDA partnership planning grants. The foundation of every successful project is a thoughtful and intentional planning process. Planning helps ensure that subsequent federal project investments are strategic, fiscally responsible, and aligned with local and regional priorities. NATO recommends Congress authorize EDA partnership planning grants at a level of at least $100 million annually. Third, I encourage the committee to restructure cost share by reducing local match. EDA's current local match requirements are often as high as 50%. This creates a huge barrier to entry for many communities. NATO recommends raising EDA's federal share to 90%, reducing local match to 10% for all EDA partnership planning grants. Additionally, we encourage reduction of local match for EDA-funded project investments as well. Fourth, Congress should enhance EDA's approach to disaster mitigation. Disaster response work is something EDA is already doing successfully, but congressional reforms could improve service delivery. Currently, EDA disaster funding is often delayed in reaching communities, in part because this funding is typically appropriated via separate end-of-year supplemental appropriations. In reauthorization, we encourage Congress to instead authorize an annual line item for disaster response, as well as a dedicated disaster bureau within EDA. This would allow EDA to deploy funds more rapidly to communities in need. And finally, it's been remarkable over the past few years to see EDA receive historic funding levels. However, I urge the committee to take steps that prevent EDA's original mission and structure from being undermined, particularly as new priorities and stakeholders emerge. In reauthorizing EDA, I encourage the committee to prioritize EDA's traditional core programs rather than creating new programs. Although some of the recent new initiatives have laid out exciting visions, it's become increasingly difficult for rural, tribal, and under-resourced communities to successfully compete in these new national competitions. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Yeah. Mr. Fetzer, thanks very much for that testimony and for joining us today. Next, we have Commissioner Higgins, and after Commissioner Higgins, we're going to hear from Mike Quaney. Commissioner Higgins.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the importance of reauthorizing the Economic Development Administration. I'm Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins. Today, I'm sharing a local perspective and the recommendations from the National Association of Counties. Rural or urban, ag center, manufacturing hub, our counties differ in lots of ways, but we all share one fundamental responsibility, which is local and regional economic development, and EDA has been an essential partner to us in that development. EDA's mission is more important today than ever as the nation deploys the historic federal investments in infrastructure, climate, broadband, and manufacturing. But these investments in physical infrastructure must be accompanied by investments in workforce infrastructure. The nation needs workers ready to build these projects at the onset and maintain them in the long run. And many of these jobs are unlike the ones we have today. So for Miami-Dade County, that's tourism. Jobs in hotels and restaurants, they're plentiful, but they also don't pay well. And that's why 15% of our residents live in poverty. That's over 400,000 people not yet living the American dream. But new EDA partnerships are changing that by helping Miami-Dade ready our workforce for higher paying jobs. So one EDA investment is building a construction trades institute to offer participants hands-on experience in traditional certifications, plumbers, welders, electricians, but also in green certifications, such as solar panel installations. And these certifications, they can be completed really quickly, less than a year, literally propelling participants into the good-paying construction and infrastructure jobs that have long provided a gateway to the middle class. Miami Tech Works was our response to EDA's Good Jobs challenges. And that brings together business leaders with educational providers to align academic programs with industry needs for a skilled tech workforce. The program upskills workers through certificate programs, associate degrees, bachelor degrees, providing multiple pathways into the high-paying tech sector. More than 170 companies are participating, and in the past 3 months, have created 100 tech internships that did not exist before. So you can see reauthorizing the EDA matters to America's counties, but of course NACO has some recommendations on how to make it even better. First, we would like to see more robust support for capacity building and pre-development, especially in communities that lack resources to fully build out their comprehensive economic development strategies. And please do consider revising the match for partnership planning grants. It's a stretch that many small and rural counties cannot meet. The economic distress formula should also be reconstituted so that the funds meet the places most in need. The current matching requirements are a non-starter for lots of good projects. The reality is that in smaller communities, it's actually more expensive to build the physical infrastructure needed to attract new industries. And when a major disaster is declared, the federal share should be 100%. Speaking of disasters, counties rely on EDA for post-disaster economic recovery activities, and Congress does too, as evidenced by the many supplemental appropriations following disasters. It's time to formalize EDA's role in disaster recovery. So I think you probably can predict our final recommendation. It's pretty simple. We'd like you to please increase EDA's annual authorized funding level to meet demand. In my county, EDA has connected people with high-quality jobs, but nationally, it has a proven track record in driving economic growth and recovery. And that's why I join NACO today to advocate for its reauthorization with increased financial support. EDA investments will long pay dividends by ensuring American workers, no matter where they live, have access to good-paying jobs, economic mobility, and real prosperity. Thank you.
Commissioner Higgins, thanks so much. Mr. Wayne, are you from Mount Hope? Bill Clinton, with whom I served when I was governor, he was president, used to say, I come from a place called Hope. And you can say, like, you come from a place called Mount Hope.
Very good.
Higher and higher. There you go. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Mike Graney. I'm from Mount Hope, West Virginia. I'm the Executive Director of the West Virginia Department of Economic Development. I've been in this role for a little over 4.5 years, since Governor Jim Justice appointed me. I still consider myself a recovering entrepreneur. So,
Well,
in my brief
you're
time
talking
in
to
this
at least one recovering governor. So.
He's still an entrepreneur. In my brief time in this role, I have a clear understanding and belief that the U.S. EDA is a critical partner to West Virginia. EDA has awarded over $220 million in funds to projects in West Virginia since 2018. EDA's assistance to coal communities has funded so many critical projects in West Virginia since its inception. It's wonderful to have a federal agency that understands the plight of rural America as it struggles to rebuild its economy after documented economic shocks. EDA has, and I hope will continue to support community-driven economic development focused on creating good-paying jobs, building economic resilience, and accelerating the economic recovery for industries and communities hit hardest by the downturn in the coal industry. Infrastructure has, and I hope will continue to be the focus of a large percentage of EDA applications because it is the link to sustaining and expanding our existing businesses and critical to the attraction of new businesses and industry. Specific recent infrastructure, water, sewer, building construction, rehab projects that assisted with new jobs for both new and existing industry and expansion in West Virginia include Nucor Steel in the Mason County Public Service District, Mountaintop Beverage and the Morgantown Utility Board, the Great Barrel Company and the White Sulphur Springs Utility Board, Public Service District, Interstate Hardwoods, the Pocahontas PSD, AmeriCarbon Enterprises, the Wyoming County EDA, Gat Creek Furniture, the Berkeley Springs and Warm Springs PSD, Westlake and Blue Racer Midstream, the Grandview Doolin PSD in the Northern Panhandle. West Virginia has successfully applied for and obtained approximately 93 projects since 2018. The EDDs, in most cases, prepare the application and administer the funds. We're one of the few states in the country that have every county in our state represented by EDDs. So the West Virginia Economic Development Department works closely with all our local economic development authorities, all the regional planning and development councils, the EDDs, and the U.S. EDA representative to West Virginia, Tracy Rowan, is truly a fantastic partner. We've nicknamed her the rock star. Actually, I gave her that title, and she truly is a rock star. You know, it really does take local, state, and federal collaboration, cooperation, and communication to deliver successful projects and ensure resiliency and sustainability. West Virginia has been an energy state and will continue to be by adopting an all-of-the-above strategy, and we will likely need U.S. EDA assistance as new methods of energy generation are put in operation. West Virginia has had several economic development successes in recent years, and we're pleased, but we must press forward. We need more. We are small, but we are nimble as a state, and that makes us very effective. While many of our counties have enjoyed the lower 20% US EDA match requirement, often those places that need infrastructure improvement the most have the least capacity to fund the match. 20% of a $4 million project is $800,000. That's a lot of money, particularly for small, impoverished counties. I urge the US EDA to consider criteria that may qualify certain projects or areas to further reduce or eliminate the local match. I think I've heard that from our other folks here, and it really is an important issue, really. And maybe there's criteria that says, okay, if these thresholds are met, we'll reduce the match or we'll eliminate the match. So thank you for the opportunity to share these remarks. Good luck with finding the appropriate level of funding to reauthorize the critical work of the US EDA. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Mr. Greeny. We've been joined by a colleague from Arizona, and he's cannot stay with us for long. And Mark, if you want to go ahead and ask a question, and maybe
Thank
say a kind word about.
We want Mr. Day to testify first and then go to
Well,
Our last person, Mr. Day.
We'll come to him. We'll come to you. That's okay. Go ahead.
okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple markups today on armed services, so I've got to run out of here. So I've got a couple questions for Mr. Fetzer from NACOG in Arizona. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Fetzer, Chris here leads the Northern Arizona Council of Governments, which is the economic development district for Northern Arizona. And he's been a leader in all economic development efforts in Northern Arizona for the past decade. Thank you for that. And you've been a tremendous asset to myself and my team. So, and Chris, thank you for making the trip. I often hear from mayors and tribal leaders that it feels like they do not have the capacity to apply for federal funding opportunities or secure private sector development deals because of a lack of funding or lack of capacity. But I understand that EDA can help, especially through partnership planning grants. And I understand that currently NACOG receives about $75,000 a year from a partnership planning grant. And in your testimony, my understanding is you recommend increasing that allocation to $250,000 a year. If NACOG receives that level of funding, what additional resources would you be able to provide to the cities and tribes in your region? And would you be able to better help rural and tribal communities take advantage of this funding?
Chairman Carper, Senator Kelly, thank you for the question. It's very germane to much of the testimony that you've heard from myself and other members of the panel this morning. The work that EDDs do with the partnership planning grant funds that are provided currently is to provide technical assistance. And if additional funding were provided through the partnership planning grants, we would simply add staff. As you're very well aware, Northern Arizona, our entire state, is large geographically, and many of the communities that we serve are under 10,000. And in that case, many of the staff working in those communities wear many hats, a few that do a lot of different jobs locally. And while they have great needs for infrastructure development and different project ideas that will help to grow the local economy, and just as importantly as creating jobs, is retaining those existing jobs, they rely on the EDDs and our staff to be that technical expertise and provide the assistance in identifying the grant opportunities, helping develop the applications and submit those. And then on the back end, NACOG, as well as many of our NATO members across the country, have the ability and the expertise to help with implementation as well as the management and administration of those grants in order to make sure that they're being spent wisely and in accordance with all of the applicable requirements.
Well, thank you. It seems like that increase would certainly, benefit these rural and tribal communities. I also want to discuss one more thing in my remaining time, and that's how EDA can help better help local governments invest in site development expenses like utility hookups, permitting expenses, and investments in workforce development. 2 weeks ago, I introduced a bill called the Onshore Act with Senator Vance, which would provide EDA with a dedicated program to support site development projects in industries that are critical to our economic and national security. So, Chris, I know you discussed pre-development costs in your opening statement, or at least I was told that, but was hoping you could expand on this. Can you explain why these projects do not compete well for EDA funding under existing programs? And can you also explain why investing in site development can sometimes be worthwhile for a community as they try to attract companies?
Chairman Carper, Senator Kelly, with respect to that question, much of the grant funding that is provided through, say, the Economic Adjustment Program by EDA to communities is for very specific aspects of projects that are based upon known companies that have committed to come to an area to expand. Sometimes we find that a community will be in a chicken and egg type of scenario where pre-development, site development funding would allow the attraction or, the expansion of existing businesses in areas where without that investment, it's not likely to occur. There are other aspects, I think, of pre-development that would be beneficial because, like Commissioner Higgins mentioned in her testimony, as important as workforce is, throughout the Intermountain West, and it's particularly acute in northern Arizona, is the availability of workforce housing, or more specifically, the lack of availability. So the ability to use pre-development or EDA planning funds to prepare workforce housing assessments would also be valuable in preparing the community to be able to expand with those projects and be able to provide housing in a way that would actually allow the attraction of the workforce.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Thanks for making time for joining us today. Mr. Day, you ready? All right. Let me just, before you speak, I'm going to telegraph a pitch. I love baseball, and one of my favorite baseball terms is telegraphing a pitch. And so when the way the pitcher holds the ball, releases the ball, you can figure it is a fastball or curveball, whatever. And so I'm going to telegraph a pitch. When we start questioning, the first question I'm going to ask is, would you all agree on what major points is there, do you hear consensus? And there's a lot of things here in Washington that divide us. Senator Capito and I are always looking for, like, what brings us together. So one of the first questions, maybe the first question I'll ask is, where do you agree? Where's the consensus on the major points that we need to be focused on? Thanks. So, all right, with that, put your gloves away, and we'll
Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today to discuss the reauthorization of the Economic Development Administration. My name is Brian Day, and I'm the Executive Director of the Little Rock Port Authority. The Port of Little Rock is Arkansas's largest public port and industrial park, and its sole purpose is to create jobs for Central Arkansas. As you heard, the Port of Little Rock is home to 50 businesses from across America and around the world. These businesses employ about 10,000 people and contribute $500 million a year to the local economy. As the Little Rock Port Authority works to attract industry and create jobs, we cannot do it alone. Over the last 20 years, we have been the recipient of a number of EDA grants through the Public Works Economic Adjustment Assistance Grant Program. I would like to share a few examples. In 2002, the Little Rock Port Authority received $2 million from the EDA to build a dock on our Slackwater Harbor. In 2005, the Little Rock Port Authority received $1.5 million from the EDA to build 2 warehouses at the Slackwater Harbor. The dock and the warehouse investments have created hundreds of opportunities to move commodities and attract new industry to the Inland River system. In 2007, the Little Rock Port Authority received $1.5 million from the EDA to build additional rail infrastructure to support Wellspun, an Indian-owned gas and oil pipe company. This company has invested over $400 million into their facility and currently employs 1,000 people. In 2019, Little Rock Port Authority received $2 million to assist with the development of road and the extension of utilities. This infrastructure investment allowed Amazon to locate at the port, where they built a 4 million square foot distribution facility at a cost of approximately $500 million. Today, that facility employs 3,000 people. In 2022, the Little Rock Port Authority received $3 million from the EDA to extend rail infrastructure to support Trex, a manufacturer of composite lumber. When Trex is fully operational, they will have invested over $400 million into their facility and will employ over 500 people. The EDA has provided $13 million in grants to the Little Rock Port Authority over the past 20 years, and while that's not a lot of money, this investment has directly resulted in over $2.5 billion in capital investment and the creation of over 5,000 jobs. I can think of no better return on an investment than what we've accomplished with the help from the EDA. I do hope the committee recommends the continuation of funding for this program. It has helped communities across the nation achieve objectives that they could not have done otherwise. However, as you consider reauthorization, I would like to ask that you take the following into consideration. 1, the Economic Development Administration was created to help develop local economies by generating new employment and stimulating industrial and commercial development. This is an effective federal program that creates lasting benefits for local communities. I would encourage the committee to remain focused on the original intent of the program. The EDA has a proven track record that has worked well and continues to work well in communities across the country. 2, local communities have a better understanding of their respective needs and know what works best for them within their specific economic development arena. EDA grant programming should remain flexible enough to give local communities the ability to design and implement projects that are best suited for those individual environments. Oftentimes, grant requirements from the agency have an adverse impact on a community's ability to apply for and manage the funds. Having the flexibility to use EDA funds with less stringent parameters will result in greater benefits to the local community. 3, the EDA grant process should remain simple. Smaller and rural communities often do not have the capacity to develop a grant application, complete the permitting, meet the timelines, and implement the program mandates established within the grant. Simplification of the process and modification of the guidelines will have a positive impact on communities and their ability to utilize these funds. Finally, the EDA should explore redefining the grant program to allow communities the ability to design and build basic infrastructure to prepare those communities for future economic development growth. Many of the grants are tied into specific job creation requirements, and this often prohibits a local community from meeting their specific future economic development needs. Allowing the EDA to invest in creating shovel-ready sites would be a game changer for our communities and greatly enhance their ability to attract jobs to the arena. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to appear before you. I wholeheartedly support the reauthorization of the Economic Development Administration. The Little Rock Port Authority could not have accomplished what we have over the past 20 years without help from the EDA. That is a given. I have shared with you some of my thoughts on changes that I believe would be beneficial to all of our communities of all sizes. I hope you will give them consideration. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you.
Mr. Day, thank you for those words, and our thanks to everybody on our panel. I mentioned to you telegraphing my pitch. That's going to be the last pitch I threw. That'll be my last question. I'll ask you to, looking back at this hearing, where's the consensus that you'd like to really emphasize? We live in a state that's about 100 miles from north to south, about 50 miles from east to west. We've got about 1 million people. Most of our people live up in the northernmost county, but we have my fastest growing area is actually Sussex County down south. When you take the State Route 1 from I-95 heading south, you go right through Sussex County, and if you keep going, you go into, Ben Cardin's joined us, we go into the Marva of Delmarva and the state of Maryland. As you drive through, just before you get into Sussex County, you go right past the town of Milford. And right on State Route 1, there are a bunch of auto dealerships. And about 10 years ago, I was one of the leaders of this committee. I held a press conference, I think it was on a Saturday morning, which is pretty unusual. We had it at one of those auto dealerships. And I think it was a Chevrolet dealership. And we had and the idea was to unveil, for the first time ever, a built in America, an electric vehicle. And the Chevrolet Volt. It got like 38 miles on a charge. We routinely get 300 miles on charges today. But it was the Chevrolet Volt. And we had a press conference, well attended, on a Saturday morning. And I would take, I got behind the wheel of the Chevrolet Volt, and they would get a camera crew or two behind me, which was pretty crowded. And then we just take off and hit the road, and it was a hoot. And we did it until all the camera crews got to go for a spin. Then it came back and concluded the event. And the fellow who was the president of the company there said, how'd you like to come back and see our maintenance shops? I said, sure. And it was a Saturday morning. Nobody was working. And I said, what are some of the challenges that you face? And he said, we have a hard time finding people who are trained or trainable and will come to work and meet our workforce needs. And he said, it's not just us. It's not just that dealership. He said, it's every dealership in the state. And it turned out we found that not only was it auto dealerships, cars, trucks, vans, but also if you look at the in the poultry industry, which is huge in our state. If you look at all the integrators, they have trucks all the time out across the road, across the eastern part of the United States. And they needed people to maintain them as well. We put together this partnership that I alluded to earlier that involved EDA. EDA is going to step in and say, with the state and the counties and the local governments will actually do X, Y, and Z, EDA will do thus and so. It worked. And we got a bunch of auto dealerships, cars, truck, vans, said we'll do our part. The state said we'll do our part through the Newcastle or through the Sussex County, through our VOTEC school districts and through our educational system. Anyway, it works, and it's still working. That's one of our great successes. Ms. Cannon, would you share with us one or two other great successes? I like to say find out what works, do more of that.
Yes, thank you, Senator. So I actually, it's interesting that you chose to speak about the Del Tech example, the Delaware Technical Community College example, which is where that occurred. That actually occurred in 2016, and it is still thriving today. So it's a great example of how an EDA investment has a long-term return on that investment, not just for the businesses, but for the people that could train there and then can go work anywhere with that skill set. Some of them go to Maryland, some of them go to New Jersey. They don't all stay in Delaware, but we're thrilled when they do.
What might be some other successes that you could point to, please?
Yeah, so the other two main successes that I think were made 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, in 2017, there was an investment made at Del State University in the, as part of the University Center for Competitiveness, and that one's still thriving. It got additional funding in 2020, and in 2021, the University of Delaware got some of the funding from EDA for the work, the tremendous work that they're doing there at the STAR campus, and then a DuPont experimental
The STAR campus, is that where the Chrysler plant used to be?
It is where the
employed
Chrysler
something
plant
like
used to be.
4,000 people, and they closed it. We lost 4,000 jobs just like that. And now the STAR campus has been created, and we've got about 4,000 people working there in all kinds of high-tech businesses.
And working in collaboration with the students, which gives them some really real-life examples, experience. And then the Delaware Innovation Space, which was a DuPont facility that was shut down, I think 235,000 square feet, and they helped to fund the renovation of that building.
Who is they? They helped to fund.
I'm sorry, EDA, sir. Thank you. Helped to fund the renovation of that building, and it is now a high-class step-up incubator, so that when somebody starts in their garage, then they go to some of the smaller incubators, and when they're ready to really ramp up, they go to the Delaware Innovation Space, and that has been a tremendous success for Delaware. So we have a lot of great successes there in Delaware because of EDA.
Yeah. Thank you for taking us down, a walk down memory lane,
Yes.
and right into the future. Thank you. That was my question, Senator Capito.
Thank you. Mr. Graney, you mentioned in your remarks about the Assistance for Coal Communities program. Certainly, we have suffered in West Virginia with the downturn in the coal industry, and that's one of the reasons that I've been particularly supportive, obviously, of this issue. Can you talk a little bit more about that program and how it's been helpful, and maybe what you see for the future of that Assistance for Coal Communities?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Capito, for the question. So, 44 of the 55 counties of West Virginia are coal field affected, communities. And so it's broad-based throughout the state. And, while there has been a big downturn in the coal economy and a lot of loss of jobs, indeed the secondary, the induced and indirect jobs as well have been reduced. So when we have the opportunity to attract a new business or an expansion of an existing business, and we get assistance from the US EDA, it really helps those communities recover. And while we have a number of communities that are still suffering and will continue until we identify that great opportunity for them, they will continue to suffer. Unique about West Virginians is that they'll travel a long way for a job, for a good job. And so what we're finding is that we had the Nucor Steel facility announced in Mason County, West Virginia. We'll have people travel for an hour and a half to a good job like that from southern West Virginia, where those coal field affected communities are suffering. So having the US EDA support the sewer there is just critically important to make that happen. Does that answer the
Yes,
question?
that does. Mr. Fetzer, you mentioned a coal community in Arizona. Are you using these funds, the Aid to Assistance to Coal Community Program, for those improvements that you mentioned?
Yes, Senator Capito, we have previously used assistance to coal communities and are continuing to with a couple of current grants that are looking at future closures. One of the lessons we learned with the previous closure it was accelerated much sooner than anticipated. The closures that are scheduled for the other remaining plants are a little bit further out, but one is as soon as 2025. And so those grants are looking at the existing assets that are there at the power plants in terms of buildings, equipment, infrastructure, water, sewer, transportation access, and the like, to determine what are the most suitable types of industries that those properties could be redeveloped to utilize. And again, that is EDA-funded planning work that is ongoing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Graney, you mentioned, I wanted to ask you about EDA maintains an interest in real property acquired or constructed or improved with agency funds for the estimated useful life of a project, which 20 years, I think. What obstacles have you encountered, and do you have any ideas for some additional flexibilities for those EDA-owned properties?
Ranking Member Capito, thanks for the question. It's a great question. And we have, in my short time there are a couple of properties that had that control put in place, that there was an interest in purchasing the property, and unfortunately, it could not be transacted because currently that program lasts for 20 years. And instead of, you have to pay the entire balance back if you sell the property before that 20-year anniversary.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it makes sense that they would pay back, the unamortized balance of the loan. In the 19th year, you wouldn't want to have to pay back $4 million. You ought to pay back $100,000 or whatever that unamortized balance is. Right. I think that kind of flexibility would do well to reduce some of the strings that other folks have talked about.
Does anybody else have that issue? Have you run into that issue? Okay. Let me ask you about, we talked a lot about, I can give you one answer on where everybody agrees, and that is the local match. So I'm not going to ask that question. That one came through loud and clear. Capacity building was the other one I heard pretty much all the way through. So I guess the other thing is the site-ready portion of this, which I'm exceedingly interested in from West Virginia as we're trying to grow our economy, and the developers have done a great job. But we also have areas that have either never been touched or have been touched maybe, outside of a brownfield. The brownfield program really works well in our state for that site development. But for those sites, I mean, I could imagine maybe we could use EDA funds, maybe not to build the physical infrastructure, or that would be good, but to at least do some of the prep work that would go in pre-building. Mr. Graney, how do you feel about that?
I feel your point exactly. I agree completely. So flexibility along those lines, West Virginia just recently, passed a site legislation to enable the development office to do some preliminary work, but not, a lot of earth moving, but doing the phase one, doing all the NEPA studies, doing, archaeological studies, doing some preliminary engineering report work to understand, and then understanding what infrastructure might cost, water, sewer, broadband, roads, you have it. At least you'd have that information, and you wouldn't have a 2-year study period to have to go through that process. You could have sort of, I refer to it as the lip of the cup strategy. All you have to do is tap it in to get it done. And so I think if we could have flexibility using US EDA funds to do that work, it could be very, very helpful. As opposed to identifying that occupant and knowing they need a 10-inch water line or what have you post. So this, having a site-ready facility could mean the difference between having someone select to move to West Virginia or not.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito. We're joined by Senator Cardin, and he's my neighbor in Delmarva, and he's to the south of us, and he's to the west of us. He's everywhere. And he's on this committee. He's stuck sitting next to me on the Finance Committee, too. But I'm glad he's hung in there.
I'm a neighbor of the chairman in Delaware, of the ranking member in West Virginia. We're neighbors. I'm sorry I'm not neighbors to my colleagues over there, but, Marylanders are all over. So anyway, it's I welcome the panel today. I strongly support the reauthorization of EDA. In 2004, it's been too long. And I agree with the ranking member that there seems to be a great deal of consensus. I just want to add my support for capacity building. I think that's an extremely important point. We have strong regional councils in Maryland. EDA is important from Appalachia, western part of our state, to the Eastern Shore, to Baltimore City. It's an important tool for economic growth, so it's important that we reauthorize it. I'll just give you one example. Now, Ms. Higgins, I'm going to ask you a question on resilience. We got a grant last year for City Dock in Annapolis. It's going to be economic growth for Annapolis. Annapolis, by the way, has more subsidized housing than most cities. People don't realize that about Annapolis. So it's going to help on economic growth, but it's also going to deal with resilience. Annapolis harbor floods all the time, not from extreme weather events. It's just the tidal flooding. So it's going to be an important project for resilience. So Higgins, Miami-Dade is challenged. Can you connect the dots for us on EDA, economic growth, and resilience?
So there's a number of things that are really important. Some of our workforce development programs are literally looking at connecting these folks that now work in very low-wage tourism jobs with the jobs we need to build the infrastructure. In some case, we have physical infrastructure that's going to have to protect us from what's coming with rising seas and whatnot. But we also have to, and we do, depend on EDA all throughout the state of Florida for disaster recovery, particularly the economic assistance. And that is one of the reasons, on behalf of the state and the county, but also on National Association of Counties, we really do believe it's time to standardize and codify EDA's role in disaster recovery. When disaster hits, we need you to be ready, not to have EDA have to prep to get ready to arrive, whether it's 3 weeks or 4 weeks later. So the role of EDA is everything from workforce development to some of our smaller communities actually funding some of the physical infrastructure to actually responding just in case we need you.
And in Maryland, we are looking at wind energy, offshore wind, and absolutely the workforce issues and job training is critically important, and connecting that dot with the EDA help would be extremely valuable. Ms. Cannon, I'm going to ask you a question about small businesses. I wear another hat. I chair the Small Business Committee here, and we're looking at the reauthorization of the SBA programs. How do we coordinate better the tools that are available for economic growth under the SBA and the EDA program? Because a lot of it overlaps, and I'm not sure how well that's coordinated.
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. I actually spent some time doing some research last night trying to imagine that kind of a question, and so thank you for that. So what I learned was that there's a lot of research out there, as I'm sure you all know, but that 64% of small businesses after a disaster suffer a loss in assets, and that's what EDA focuses on, right? The assets. Did you lose a building? Did you lose a generator? Do you need new equipment? But I believe it was 94% lose revenue. And so in my world, in the Division of Small Business at the state of Delaware, we tried our best when COVID hit and the shutdown happened to say, how do we save as many? We know that Ellicott City was a great case study for us in preparing what we wanted to do for COVID, because when they flooded for the fourth or fifth time, what the case study showed was that some of the businesses just shut down. They said, we're done, we're tired, we're not rebuilding again. But some of them relocated. And when they relocated, working for the rebuilding to happen, they found a new home and they found new customers, so they just never came back. So it's so important that the SBA focus on cash flow, right? Getting those EIDL loans out to help them with the cash flow issue they have when revenue stops. And then EDA, I think, has to be able to step up. I think the biggest challenge for EDA and stepping up for small businesses is that at a high level, EDA says, well, who's going to own the asset? If a private company is going to own it, that's not really what we do. And so I guess my struggle is, how do I help my small businesses who need an asset when EDA says that's not really what I do?
Thank you. I just make an observation. Ellicott City had 2 100-year floods within 20 months. So it's been really challenged on how to deal with the increased flooding in that community. And to Senator Capito, the western part of my state, as you know, also had coal. And so it's important for us to use the tools we can on economic growth for our under EDA and also under the ARC program to help those communities. So I'm glad to see that there is a focus on that.
Senator Cardin, thanks so much for doing it. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet.
Mr. Day, as you outlined in your testimony, the Little Rock Port Authority has had great success in partnership with EDA with acquiring $13 million in grant funding and leveraging to tremendous economic development. Can you talk about the decisions that go into applying for EDA funding for the Little Rock Port and your experiences working with EDA in executing both the application process and project delivery?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for always supporting the Port of Little Rock and Central Arkansas. We're grateful for that. So in terms of working with the EDA, we have a great relationship with the EDA. Your staff, the EDA staff, does a remarkable job working with communities. I have no qualms with that. They're responsive and eager to help us, and the folks we work with on a daily, weekly basis are really good. When we work with EDA grants through the port, and I'm mainly talking about kind of the public works infrastructure investment, they are all tied into specific job creation. And that is a time-consuming. Sometimes you have to wait till you get a prospect that announces, and then you contact the EDA and say, we've got this prospect that's going to bring 500 jobs and invest X number of dollars. Can we apply for infrastructure, or can we apply for road extension assistance? And as you've heard today in this capacity conversation, when a prospect comes to a community, any community in America, they're not looking to locate at the community. They're looking for reasons to not locate at the community. And if we tell them that it's going to take 6 to 12 to 18 months to get the site ready, then that's a reason they might choose to go elsewhere. And we're no longer just competing with our neighbors, we're competing with the world. When we saw with the pandemic and the supply chain challenges, there's a lot of interest in reinvesting in manufacturing and distribution. So in working with EDA and how we decide to do it, when this prospect comes and they finally choose us, we've convinced them that we can deliver the site within 12 to 18 months with all the infrastructure, the roads. We work with the state and the county and the local governments, and we bring EDA into the equation kind of as part of that ongoing conversation. And that we tell them, here's what we can bring, here's what we need, and they work with us. So you've heard, the committee's heard today that it would be nice to have be able to do some preliminary work, some advanced work, and that's what I hope that we'll be able to do in the future.
Good. Arkansas is a small state. We all kind of know each other. We work together. As you know, many rural communities in Arkansas, similar to rural communities across the United States, are losing businesses, employment opportunities, and population. 53% of the counties in America lost population in the last census. Many of these areas have benefited from programs that target rural economic development, such as investment from the EDA. The EDA is such a valuable resource for so many people who need this help. However, most of these communities are at a disadvantage when applying for any grant funding because they lack the bandwidth or expertise to submit a, quote, top application. Can you talk about the importance of keeping this process as simple as possible? And I hope that's the theme of today, in addition to being focused on the intent of the program.
Yes, sir. Thank you. A good question. As I mentioned in my comments, we have to keep the program simple. I will tell you, we get a lot of grants from different federal agencies, and the EDA is some of they're easier to work with than others. But when you go into a small rural community and you have to get all the engineering done, the permitting, the cost analysis, the benefit, then you have to implement the mandates with the program that might be apprenticeships or resiliency or equity, and all of those things are important, but a small community struggles with that. You've heard today from all of my colleagues, the match is burdensome, and if it's a $1 million project and it's a 20% match, $200,000 is hard for a small community to get. So as you look to reauthorize, if you can make it simpler, if you could, I heard someone talk about kind of a formula-based incentive instead of competitive. That might be a good approach for certain communities. But we do know, and we've seen success in rural Arkansas, if you have an available property, an available building, a prospect will locate there. But for a community to have to do all the heavy lifting on the front end, to manage the grant, and then even after the fact, once you build it, you're not done with the management of the grant. You have to report annually and keep coming back. That does create challenges for a community that has a volunteer city council or volunteer quorum court that, has a staff of 4 or 5 people. It is a challenge, so simple is better.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Senator Markey, thank you for coming back. And you're recognized. And after you, Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard for some communities to even get started. Match requirements are one reason why communities struggle to get projects off the ground. So, Ms. Cannon, how would reducing or eliminating funding match requirements in economic development administration programs help smaller communities access these investments?
Senator, I think it would be an amazing change that would help the smallest and most rural communities to get access to these funds. I did some research just on the Philadelphia regional office because I've lived in Delaware all my life, it's what I know. So I looked and just at the state level, compared the unemployment rate of every state and the 2 territories, Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, that the EDA office in Philadelphia is responsible for. None of them would have qualified for the maximum contribution from EDA or maximum investment in 2004. And as recently as April 2023, only one from a statewide perspective would have qualified, and that would have been the United States Virgin Islands. And so when you look at those numbers, Senator Carper had asked us a couple of months ago to pull together a focus group in our rural part of the state because they were so frustrated with EDA. And again, the EDA folks are really nice. They try really hard. But the EDA staff was frustrated that our rural community folks did not have the capacity. And so it was kind of a chicken and egg scenario where everybody wants to get to yes, but they couldn't get there. And so I think that change would be dramatic.
Thank you. And aside from having cash on hand to fulfill match requirements, there is a lot of work that has to happen before communities are even ready to apply for grants, much less construct and develop projects. Communities need to pay for environmental studies, put together business plans and grant applications, and conduct architectural and engineering work, and all of that requires money and time. Ms. Cannon, based on your experience working with communities who are interested in making the most of funding opportunities, what can help communities best prepare shovel-ready projects?
Well, in the state of Delaware, we were fortunate in that issue became a big issue, and again, geographically, we're relatively small. So we were able to, for the last 3 years, our governor and our legislature approved $10 million a year in what they call a site readiness fund. And they compete directly for those dollars, the developers do, that have sites that they want to get ready. The problem is it's not enough, and it certainly isn't enough if you try to do that across the country. But EDA today would say, when you look at the NOFO and you try to find a way to get to yes, the NOFO looks like maybe they would provide funding for that. But then when you set up the call with the EDA regional office and your community that wants to do it, they start asking questions. How far along are you on the engineering? Do you have this? Do you have that? And the local communities get frustrated and hang up and call us and say, we don't think the EDA is easy to work with.
I got it. Mr. Fetzer, would funding for project pre-development and technical assistance help communities navigate the overwhelming number of grant programs and funding opportunities?
Senator Markey, yes, absolutely. Those types of activities that you just described in your remarks, very consistent with Ms. Cannon's comments as well in terms of how communities can be prepared to bring that investment. And currently, without that eligibility, that is a barrier.
And that's why I'm planning to reintroduce the Local Infrastructure Funding and Technical Assistance Act, or the LIFT Act, which would provide grants to under-resourced communities that want to bring beneficial projects into their communities. The funding would help cover the cost of market assessment, business plan preparation, capacity building for local governments and organizations, grant writing, and much more. Mr. Fetzer, would you agree that dedicated funding for pre-development activities could help kickstart projects that may otherwise never go forward?
Yes, Senator Markey, I would agree with that statement. I had a similar question earlier from Senator Kelly and described it in some scenarios as a chicken and egg. And this type of funding would certainly allow us to overcome that and allow projects to proceed.
No, thank you. And rural communities, urban communities, low-income communities, everyone deserves a chance to build resilient infrastructure and benefit from these new historic programs. We thank all of you for your work on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Ricketts, thanks for coming again and again.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, for calling this hearing so we can talk about the EDA. And I want to thank our panelists for your testimony and sharing your experiences with the EDA. Nebraska has been a recipient of a number of these grants, and one in particular I'm going to highlight has to do with Blair, Nebraska. We received a grant through the Assistance to Nuclear Closure Communities for over $1.5 million, which helped the city of Blair expand its water line. And one of the things it did when it expanded this water line, it supported a biotechnology campus that produces enzymes that help us produce, guess what, Chairman Carper? Ethanol.
Wait a minute. 40 seconds.
You knew I was going to figure out a way to tie this back into ethanol, didn't you? I love this committee because we get to talk about ethanol on it. But one of the other companies on this campus, which would be fascinating to know about, has a unique fermentation process that takes, again, some of the same sugars that come out of ethanol that, and produce omega-3 fatty acids, which then is fed to salmon and fish farms, which prevents the need for then going out and catching wild fish, cutting them up and feed the salmon so that they get the same omega-3. So it becomes much more sustainable. So very cool way to make a sustainable way to have fish farms. Anyway, that's one of the other businesses supported on doing it. But the point is it allows smaller communities like Blair to be able to invest and grow campuses that create great paying jobs. These are great paying jobs that they have here. And I was just on with the entire Nebraska delegation. We're doing a farm bill tour on Monday and heard consistently about the importance of water infrastructure for small communities to be able to, for example, facilitate food processing or dairy operations or things like that. So it's absolutely a critical thing to be able to do, and just wanted to be here today to add my sentiments to what's already been expressed about the need to reauthorize the EDA at fiscally responsible levels and to preserve the ability of local economic development decisions. So with that, I yield back.
Fair enough. Thanks, and thanks for bringing the perspectives of a recovering governor. At least two of us here. Senator Padilla, welcome.
Thank you,
California,
Chairman.
the Golden State.
Ranking Member Capito. Appreciate the opportunity to chime in on this hearing as well. I want to begin by just echoing one of the items and issues that Senator Markey raised, and that's utilizing resources to assist smaller cities, smaller jurisdictions that may not have the capacity of larger jurisdictions in preparation and competing for different grants and other resources. So I won't be repetitive of his questions, just want to associate myself with his concern as a priority as well. Now, separately, we often discuss loss of life and physical damage in the aftermath of natural disasters, but we rarely focus on the longer-term economic challenges for entire communities that can persist for months or years after a disaster hits. This committee's had numerous hearings and conversations about wildfires, long-term drought, flooding, other types of extreme storms, routinely forcing shops to close, small businesses to shut down, jobs to leave towns, and personal savings to run dry when individuals have to dip into their own pockets to cover insurance. And entrepreneurs, small business owners have to rebuild. So in times of increasingly devastating natural disasters, the EDA's mission to promote a resilient economy and address rapidly evolving economic conditions, I think must prioritize disaster recovery. Again, not just short, immediate aftermath, but for the long term. It's one of the reasons I plan to introduce legislation to establish the Office of Disaster Recovery within the EDA. This office would be tasked with coordinating post-disaster economic recovery initiatives and ensure that we rebuild holistically are impacted communities beyond just initial critical repairs. So, Ms. Higgins and Mr. Fetcher, this sounds familiar to you because in both your written and your verbal testimony earlier, you referenced your specific recommendations for the establishment of an EDA Bureau or Office of Disaster Resilience and Recovery. Would you each just take another minute to reinforce to the committee why it's so important for Congress to do so? Beginning with Ms. Higgins.
Thank you, Senator. Having a robust role that is codified for EDA and disaster recovery is really important. Congress is using EDA in this role, but because we haven't reauthorized and formalized it, it can be ad hoc and it can often be reactive rather than proactive. So the idea of formalizing it is really important to America's counties, that for a couple reasons. It means the agency has institutional knowledge that carries on from one community's experience to other. It has leadership that has led through these difficult situations. And then, quite frankly, it has good relationships and knowledge about the communities that are often on the receiving end of these considerations. EDA is also very helpful because, I'll use an example, versus the EIDL loans and SBA, very strict, quite frankly, to apply for one of those. During COVID, our small businesses could not meet the requirements. But then we have other revolving loan funds that EDA allows to establish, which are more attuned to these local businesses that have never, ever had to have access to capital before. So it's a great marriage between having the disaster recovery response and the long-term knowledge that EDA already has in economic assistance.
Thank you. Mr. Fetzer, anything to add?
Senator Padilla, yes, I would agree with Commissioner Higgins' comments. Really institutionalizing it in a way that retains that knowledge and the ability to be, again, proactive and not a lagging response when communities are most in need would be quite valuable.
Great. Now, I want to make sure that I'm clear that our main streets, our commercial corridors, and business districts, especially in smaller jurisdictions, need our ongoing attention, not just in the aftermath of a disaster. Last Congress, Senator Wicker and I introduced a Revitalizing Small and Local Businesses Act, which would provide resources for nonprofit organizations to also provide operating support, technical assistance, and training to networks of business district organizations working on the ground in underserved and rural communities, as well as urban neighborhoods. Ms. Higgins, how do partnerships with local organizations and larger nonprofit organizations strengthen EDA's efforts to serve these business districts?
Well, I'll tell you one example. We've got a great EDA grant that is working to enable tech folks from low-wage jobs to get into high-paying tech jobs. But when you're transferring people from the service economy into middle class and higher paying jobs, that transition is just not you take a class and get certified in this. Folks have trouble getting to work. They may need social services or supportive service about how to transition into a more professional style of workforce. So in our EDA grant, we actually have nonprofit partners that are providing those wraparound services for one entire year after the person gets their first high-paying job to make sure that it's a long-term success. We want people lifted out of poverty with EDA assistance, but we want them to stay out of poverty, not falling back because this is their first time in a different sort of workplace.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You bet. Thanks so much for joining us today. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you. I just have one final question for the panel. EDA investment priorities, which are used as a criterion in reviewing project applications, can change from administration to administration. For example, the Biden administration removed critical infrastructure and opportunity zones as priorities, while equity and environmentally sustainable development were added. It seems to me that Congress should provide some stability here. So we'll start with you, Ms. Cannon. Do you have any light to shed on that particular issue?
I'll pause for a moment because obviously I led the state of Delaware's effort on opportunity zones when that was first passed. And I think that the biggest concern most of us who were involved in opportunity zones had was that the original intent was to really get the funds invested in those really distressed communities.
Right.
And what ended up happening, or what it appears ended up happening, was really rich people that were going to build a hotel in a really upscale
That
neighborhood.
same thing happened in our state.
Yeah, right, it happened everywhere. And
Right.
so but I think the spirit of the Opportunity Zone was good. I would hope that we go back to looking at a census tract level. To Mr. Padilla's comment about the Main Street corridors. The biggest challenge, I think, when EDA is looking at their objectives is that you might have a little pocket community that just had a plant shut down or just had something horrible happen, but they're surrounded by a neighborhood in their, a census tract next door that's doing really well.
Yeah.
And so as a standalone census tract with 5,000 or 8,000 people, sometimes they can't get the help they need. So yes, I think having Congress put some stability into that if in fact an economic development office in a state, in a county, in a community builds around that objective, that objective doesn't change.
Mr. Fetzer, do you have any comments?
Senator Capito, I believe that some of those considerations that you mentioned are important, but the predictability because of the needs of communities, particularly rural, small communities, those needs don't change over time. They're
Right.
foundational to building a strong economic ecosystem so that you can attract and retain business. So those things are important, but they could also become a distraction from pursuing the investments that our communities need.
So basically, the way I'm interpreting your answer here is the core functions have to remain the same, or the core decision-making has to revolve around the same core principles from administration to administration. You could add things on maybe as things go, around, but I'm thinking, as we're looking at a reauthorization, I'm not sure how specific we would want to be, but we've got to have the core functions remain the same. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, well, I would agree. And, there is regulatory flexibility too within
Right.
EDA that helps to address changes over time.
So keep that. Ms. Higgins, do you have a comment on that?
We had a similar situation with opportunity zones as Ms. Cannon had. I think opportunity zones locked us into an actual place versus economic development opportunities, which can occur in a different piece of property, but still aptly serve people that are in need of routes to prosperity and better jobs.
Right.
I think predictability matters. It certainly matters for these smaller counties, right? If they've managed to apply once, why the heck do you want to make it so complicated to apply a second time? But even a big county like mine, with these pre-development on these sites, which can take 2 years, if 4 years later the rules are changed, we may have the resources to do our pre-development in the way that rural counties may not, but then we might not qualify for something in the long run. So some consistency is always a good thing.
Okay. Mr. Graney?
I think these guys are the pros. I've only been doing this for 4 years. I can't add to
Okay.
what they've said.
All right. Mr. Day?
Yes, Senator, I agree. I think that the changing priorities, changing requirements, changing programs from administration to administration do make it a burden on communities. Not everyone can do it. It's federalism at its finest. The program works well. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it streamlined. Let's focus on the creation of jobs and not put those other requirements every 4 years or every 8 years into the program. It's a team sport, it's a long sport, and it takes a lot of time to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. And my final comment, Mr. Chairman, is Mr. Graney mentioned Tracy Rowan, who is our West Virginia EDA, and what a difference she makes. I mean, having that right resource that's paying attention to your state, and in our lucky case, our state alone, has just been, in her consistency and knowledge, has been incredible. So I'm going to give a shout out to our rock star, Tracy Rowan at the EDA. She's fantastic.
Thank you so much for that. And she doesn't just say this at a hearing.
I don't say that about you. Oh, just kidding.
She doesn't just brag on the EDA's point person, West Virginia. And at a hearing, she says it regularly. So we're blessed in our region as well. I've been joined by Senator Dan Sullivan from the great state of Alaska. Danny, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses. I have just really one kind of basic question to get your insights, all the witnesses, and it's really it's actually reflective of the title of the hearing, which is getting state and local perspectives. You know, in Alaska, we are often subject, I think most states feel this way, where the federal government's about 5,000 miles away from my state, and they often don't understand us. And then they come up with one-size-fits-all approaches to policy and economic development that was crafted here, and of course it just doesn't work in my state. I'm assuming that all of you have had similar experiences, so maybe I can just start with the basic question of, when we're looking at the reauthorization process now, which is a good opportunity, to instill the value of preserving locally driven economic development decisions and making sure EDA does not become kind of an entity that is a Washington, D.C. bureaucracy that directs everybody. So how do we ensure that? Locally driven economic development decisions as a key component of EDA, and I'm assuming you guys all think that's important. So, Mr. Day, why don't we just start with you and we'll go down the line.
Thank you, Senator. I do think that every community is different, and every community knows what's best for them. And so as you draft the reauthorization, you look at the programs, try to preserve the ability for that community to present a project or implement a program that meets their needs. Because what works in Alaska might not work in Arkansas, might not work on the East Coast. I'm not quite sure how you do that in the programmatic drafting of the bill, but don't lose sight of local communities know best for them.
In your point, in Arkansas, there might be a real emphasis on one area of your economy that we don't even have in Alaska, and vice versa, right?
That is true. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Good.
Senator, I'd agree with everything he just said, and I think it is critically important to keep the local flavor. And, you know, Alaska's different from West Virginia. West Virginia's different from Arkansas, Dade County.
Do you think the current EDA approach has enough of that local flavor, or is it getting too centralized in Washington?
So I've only been in this role for about 4.5 years, but it's been my impression that it does have that local flavor currently.
Okay, good.
Senator, I think I agree. Mr. Graney said it well. There is a lot of ability, and from the examples we've shared here, we're all from different places, that how we are implementing in different counties and different states economic development, EDA has been able to help us fund. But I think one of the themes you have heard us talk about today is there are places that remain locked out of getting this funding, and the match requirements have been rigid enough that, particularly for some smaller places, good projects, and remember, we talk about locking projects and places out of economic opportunity. We're actually locking people out of that option. So I think in this reauthorization, looking at making sure those matching requirements are not stopping development in places that really need it is a way to make EDA even more responsible and responsible for these locally developed initiatives.
Good, thank you.
Senator Sullivan, in terms of the matching fund burden requirements, I'm in full agreement that we need to reduce those so it...
What is I don't even know what it is right now. What's the typical match?
Well, it can be as much as 50% in some cases, but it depends. That's probably the best answer.
And is it dependent on ability to pay?
It's not dependent on ability to pay. It's based on distress factors. And that's one of the things that many of us have touched on in our testimony here today, is that the needs or the merits of projects may not have a direct relationship with the ability of that jurisdiction to pay match, but the need is great.
So you think that's a reform that is recommended?
Correct.
Okay.
I would also speak to the planning process, because there have been numerous references to locally driven solutions. And while EDA has a requirement for each economic development district to create a comprehensive economic development strategy known as the SEDS, The SEDS, if it's done right within a region, is all about locally driven solutions in response to what's different between Alaska and Arizona and Massachusetts can be accounted for in those planning processes so that we can identify what the most important needs are and how to grow local economies. And if we do it right too, we're using a robust engagement process with stakeholders to really understand their needs.
Good, great, thank you.
Great question, Senator. I will say this, that I have a minor in psychology, which makes me dangerous, right, because I think I know things. But I will tell you that my perspective of EDA and how they implement is that they implement from a utilitarian perspective. They want to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The Tech Hub solicitation that, or NOFO that is out now is saying, and they told us specifically, don't apply as a state. We want you to be regional. We want you to be able to say, we touch this many people in this many geographic territories. And while that's noble in some respects to say for every public dollar we invested, we touched the greatest number of communities and the greatest number of people, the reality is that some of the people with the greatest need will never get the opportunity to participate in EDA funding because they can't meet the match. They can't meet the eligibility criteria. And so I'm a firm believer. I used to be the executive director of the Delaware Workforce Board. I'm an active member now. I firmly believe that every community across this country has an active local and state board that lives under U.S. Department of Labor regulations. They meet regularly. They have the 50% membership has to be from the private sector who are creating those jobs. They have to have ultimate hiring and decision-making authority and policy-setting authority. I think there are ways to help EDA kind of find the right balance. Again, to some degree, there's real value in the utilitarian approach. But I would hope, I can tell you right now, I have 3 little communities that will never qualify under EDA standards for the match, for the eligibility, but the need is great.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to help them in the absence of some of those changes. So we're hoping that that happens through reauthorization.
Great, great. Thank you. Those are great answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sullivan, thanks so much for joining us. A couple of things I want to mention. I'm glad that Senator Sullivan raised the issue that led us to talk about SEDS, SCDS, and which is, I understand, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. For years in Delaware, we couldn't understand why we couldn't get to first base on economic development, on EDA support for our, and it turns out because we were not providing and updating on a regular basis a comprehensive economic development strategy. Do y'all have any idea if other states are guilty of not providing an updated SEDS from on a regular basis? Anybody know? Because that seems like that's like in terms of admission to actually making progress and getting this support from EDA. You got to have a SEDS. Do you believe that most states do that? I should ask Alejandra Castillo. She I'd ask that question. Anybody know?
I may not know, Senator, about the states because at least in our state we have several regions that have to create them. But Mr. Fetzer, I think, highlighted this very clearly. Right now, for smaller communities, some of these EDDs that develop the SEDS are huge geographically, and the $70,000 to $75,000 that's currently allowed, I mean, you know, it doesn't matter where you live, that does not cover the cost of one full-time employee, right, to get and do these things. So I would say they may, even if they are complying, they don't have the staffing because of that level of funding to make sure that it's adequate, it's up to date, and it's inspiring to attract economic development in some areas.
Okay. Patty, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I can tell you that if you submit an application.
Who is you?
I'm so sorry, sir.
If you submit, if I submit, you say if you
I'm
submit.
sorry, if you submit. Yes, sir, if you submit. No, if anybody submits an application.
No,
to
not
EDA,
anybody can submit. When you say you, who are you talking about?
An eligible entity.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, sir. An eligible entity submits an application to EDA. The first thing they will do is to look to see if you have an active SEDS. If you do not, you will not, it doesn't go any further. And so that's, maybe that's an important criteria to try to encourage states and communities, but I think Ms. Higgins makes a great point in that Delaware geographically and demographically is small, so the people that get involved in writing the SEDS generally all know each other. The larger the state, the less likely that is to be true. And so that's the other reason that I firmly believe that while the SEDS is a nice thing to have every 5 years and to have the state get together with stakeholders and say, what do we envision our state to look like over the next 5 years? I still think the state and local boards, the workforce boards, are where the rubber meets the road in most of our communities.
All right, thanks for that. When I was governor, I had the opportunity to participate in the National Governors Association, and I remember us petitioning, at that time I think it was the Clinton administration, and maybe later the Bush administration, for federal support. And the question is, there was always a question about what would be an appropriate balance of federal support as opposed to state and local support. And one of the things that I learned early on, rather than just give money to states, you have to have some skin in the game. And I think there's a balance here between making sure that we're providing the money where it's most needed, can be put to best use, but also to make sure that there's skin in the game. Because if there's not, that sometimes we don't spend the money as wisely as otherwise we should. I have a follow-up question, I could, on climate resiliency for Ms. Higgins. And the EDA's Public Works program helps distressed communities upgrade and build physical infrastructure, as you know. And due to the climate crisis, low-lying places like Miami-Dade, Dade County, and in my own state of Delaware, Maryland, and other coastal states are under threat due to rising sea levels and an increased frequency of extreme weather events that we see all too often. Commissioner Higgins, do you think there are opportunities for EDA to maybe do more to incorporate climate resiliency into its public works program, please?
I certainly think it should be considered, and this would be another case where perhaps EDA can collaborate with other programs that exist. For example, in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there is funding available, for example, for raising off-system bridges to be more accommodating to rising seas, to looking at improvements that make not just coastal communities, but communities across America less vulnerable to things like flooding. So yes, public works right now, we should be thinking, and I believe every local community is thinking about what do we need to be building to make sure our communities are more resilient in the face of a changing climate and in the face of a changing workforce and economic conditions. Resiliency is, I can't think of a single county in Florida that doesn't have resiliency as a top priority, from the largest one is mine, Miami-Dade County, to our most rural counties in Florida.
All right, thank you. My sister and I were born in a coal mining town, as Senator Capito was born in a coal mining town called Beckley, and about 70, 80 miles south of Charleston. And my grandparents' neighbors were coal miners. And I remember my sister and I as little kids being at our grandparents' house, and Mr. Meadows, who was their neighbor, would come home late afternoon from mining coal, his face like black with soot, and he'd clean up and go out and milk his cow. And I still remember he would invite my sister and I to come and help him milk his cow. We're just little kids. And then we would get to drink some of the milk. And it's a memory I will always cherish, and I think my sister does too. My grandfather was a butcher, and he was not just a butcher at Patton's Market in Beckley, but before that he was a butcher and a general store that was owned by a coal mining company. And the coal mining company, like in the next region, if you will, next to where my grandfather was a butcher, the butcher there was Robert Byrd, who went on to become the most elected senator in the history of the country. And so you never know where those butchers are going to go. But an interest and a concern about coal miners in West Virginia has been part of who I am all of my life. Having said that, the state that I live in now is a state where, as my colleagues have heard me say probably too often, we're the lowest lying state in the country. Is Patty Cannon, the lowest lying state. My state is sinking. The seas around us are rising, and that's not a good thing when one of your top two industries in your state is tourism. And one of the reasons why people flock to Delaware is because we have more five-star beaches than any state, I think, in the country. So that's for economic development, the ability to actually, how do we address climate change? How do we do that in a way that creates jobs? As it turns out, there's a ton of jobs that are being created off of our shores. But Senator Cardin mentioned in his, and when he was here with us, he said in Maryland we're looking at offshore wind. They're not just looking at offshore wind. We're deploying offshore windmill farms from off of Rhode Island all the way down to Maryland, and we're doing it with putting like thousands of people to work in good paying jobs, a lot of jobs creating just in developing and building the wind turbines are going to be that are being deployed, you know. And but as we do all of that, and I mentioned some of the factors that drive economic development that I learned a long time ago when I was a youngster working at the Division of Economic Development. I did not mention the cost of power, and that's a hugely important element in a lot of industries and a lot of job creation. And one of the places we have learned how to address, build, or create power fairly cheaply is wind and solar and other. In the meantime, the question is, what do we do with all the people who are displaced? Like folks who work in fossil fuel industries and so forth. We have an obligation, I think a moral obligation, to look after them as well. And in our state, I hope we're taking that moral obligation seriously, and I know they are in West Virginia. I said earlier I wanted to telegraph my pitch, and the pitch I wanted to telegraph was to ask as the last question, where do you think there's a consensus here, and maybe some important consensus? Senator Sullivan and I spent a lot of years in the military. He's a retired, I think, a Marine colonel. I'm a retired Navy captain, and we were in a lot of training in the Navy. Most people think you graduate from high school or college where you go in the military and you never have any more training. No, you train all the time. And in the Navy, we have for our training, we'd have to take tests and so forth. And our instructors would say, they would stomp their foot, literally, and say, this is something that's going to be on the test. And they would not always say this is going to be on the test, but they'd stomp their foot. This is a chance for you to stomp your feet and to tell us it's not what's going to be on the test, but if we take out nothing else out of here at the end of this hearing, what are one or two of my really important things? And just do it very crisply and succinctly. Patty, would you lead us off, please?
Thank you, sir. So you just want one item?
Just give us one.
One item is let's fix that match. I don't know what that fix looks like, but I think we need to fix that match.
All right, thank you. Mr. Fetzer.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. Really do appreciate the dialogue that we've had with the committee today. I think first and foremost would be increasing the investment in EDA's core programs like partnership planning.
All right, thank you. Ms. Higgins.
Well, first and foremost, reauthorize the EDA, because all of these reforms cannot happen and modernization if that doesn't occur. And I think all of the ideas and all of the examples you've seen here, but also some of the challenges we face, can be addressed if we have a modern reauthorization that helps with match, that helps with access, that helps with the different sorts of projects and workforce that didn't exist when it was reauthorized last.
Good, thank you for that. Right. Mr. Green.
So fix the match, and however that's appropriate to do. Keep it simple and make it a little bit more flexible. Have it address other needs.
All right. In the Navy, we had something we call the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid.
I agree with all that's been said, Senator. I would add that allow local communities the ability to build their capacity for future economic development through the creation of shovel-ready sites.
Good, thanks. Senator Capito, any last words?
Thank you all very much. It's terrific. We have a vote, and so I'm going to be slipping out. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for
and our
coming.
thanks to our staffs as well. Maybe one last thought. I talked about moral obligation. People ask me what I like most about my job. I like helping people. And I think if you ask Senator Capito or anybody else that serves on this committee, they pretty much say the same thing. We love helping people. And one of the best ways you can help somebody is make sure they have a job. And make sure they have a job so they can support themselves and their families and be a contributing member of our society. There's a lot of different ways we make that happen. And one of the important ways is through an entity that we call EDA, Economic Development Administration. And as I said early on, everything I do, I know I can do better. And clearly, you've come up with some ideas that we could actually do. The federal government can meet its obligations and opportunities better by making some changes within the EDA. And you've given us plenty to think about. The other thing I just want to say is thank you for what you do with your lives. I hope your work gives you as much joy as mine has given me for all these years. But if we don't have jobs, and we don't have the opportunity for people to go to work and support themselves and their families, at the end of the day, we don't have much. So this is just critically important stuff. And the last thing is, not that you would know this is a committee that actually works well together. We're a committee that believes that bipartisan solutions generally are lasting solutions. And so that's where we work, whether it's bipartisan infrastructure legislation, water, roads, highways, bridges, water redevelopment, you name it. I mean, clean air. We try to do work across the aisle as much as we can to get things done. And a lot of instances to not only do good things for the planet, but actually create economic opportunities and jobs for people to go to. So with that, I would say, in the closing, I have like some boilerplate stuff here I have to read, so we'll be in good shape here. But not only want to thank all of you for joining us today, but we have to do some housekeeping. Let me just say, with that in mind, senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record by close of business on Wednesday, July the 12th. Wednesday, July the 12th. And we'll compile those questions. We'll send them to you, to our witnesses. We're going to ask you to try to reply to us by Wednesday, July 26th. It's Wednesday, July 26th. And again, I just want to say to our staffs who have worked diligently to pull all of you together and to make sure that this was a meaningful hearing and a productive hearing, our thanks to all of them. And with that, anything else? I think that with that, it's a wrap. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you so much.